Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave and this is my daily ruling. I got the idea for today's video after watching a couple of shorts on Keeping It Casual's channel. Amy controls Ashling the Limitless. Can she cast Consume Bonfire from her hand for 4 mana? Alright, so the answer to this question is no. If you're just going based off the printed wording of the card, the answer would have been yes, since there's no rule that says Evoke only works on permanent spells, but WotC decided that 4 mana Consume Bonfire was just a little too broken, so they issued a errata to Ashling so that it only affects permanent spells to stop this from working. Now, I kind of speed ran that one because I have another question that I'm going to talk about that's related in that it also has to do with Ashling, but I knew that people would be asking me about this question if I didn't mention it, so I figured I'd get it out of the way early, and if you're still interested in a deeper explanation, I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer, which you should be well capable of, armed with the concepts I'll be covering in the discussion of this other question, which is, Amy evokes a terrain elemental using Ashling Limitless. Nick responds by playing a Doomblade against Ashling, killing it. Does Amy still have to sacrifice terrain elemental due to Evoke? Does the answer depend on when specifically Nick cast his removal spell? Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the text for Evoke from the comprehensive rules. This is important anytime we're going to be asking questions where the answer depends on exactly how the ability works. Even though that italicized text in parentheses does a pretty good job reminding people of what Evoke does if they forgot or didn't already know, that's just a summary of how it works, not binding rules text. So if a question requires understanding exactly how Evoke interacts with some other mechanic or specific scenario, the best practice is to look up exactly what it does in an official authoritative source. So as we can see, Evoke is composed of 2 different abilities. Anytime a card has Evoke, what that means is that it has these 2 abilities. The first one says you can cast the card for its Evoke cost. The second is a triggered ability that triggers when the card with Evoke enters the battlefield, and it makes you sacrifice it if you paid that Evoke cost. Now that you've seen exactly how Evoke functions, we can say, like all enters the battlefield abilities, in order to function, that ability needs to exist immediately after the trigger event happens. I talked about this in my video about Evoke plus Dress Down. To put it more concretely, Amy only has to sacrifice Terrain Elemental if it has the Evoke ability immediately after it enters the battlefield. There's 2 plausible reasons I can see why someone might doubt that this would be the case. In the first place, Ashling says elemental spells you cast from your hand have Evoke. If Terrain Elemental stops having Evoke once it stops being a spell, there's no reason to sacrifice it. And hey, that brings up the second point. I think that if you had a Thicket Crasher that was giving all your elementals trample, and then someone played a removal spell against your Thicket Crasher, I don't think anyone would be trying to argue that your elementals would still have trample after Thicket Crasher died, right? So if you think about that in terms of what happened in the original problem statement, it sort of seems like the terrain elemental should not have Evoke once it's on the battlefield if you manage to get rid of Ashling before that happened. So let's take a look at what the rules have to say about each of these issues. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while now, you might recall that I covered a similar scenario a few years ago in my video evaluating how Henzi Toolbox Tor works. In fact, for technical reasons very similar to what we were talking about here, it turned out that that card actually didn't work when it was first printed, and after my original video, WotC changed the rules to address this. So let's have a look at how Henzi Tor works and see if any of that might be relevant to this discussion. First, we'll have a look at this rule, which says that effects from static abilities that grant an ability to a permanent spell that functions on the battlefield continue to apply to the permanent that spell becomes. As noted previously, Evoke does function on the battlefield, and Ashling has a static ability that grants Evoke 2 permanent spells. So this rule addresses the first of the 2 problems that we talked about earlier. Even though Ashling is worded such that its ability only applies to spells, this rule allows that effect to continue to apply to those permanents after they enter the battlefield. Now, if you were paying attention when I brought that last rule up, you might have noticed a little bit at the end where it says see Rule 611.3d. Usually when I'm making the graphics for my CR citations, I edit cross-references like these out to save space, but I went ahead and left this one in because it seemed relevant. Let's have a look. Continuous effects from static abilities may grant an ability to a permanent spell that allows it to be cast. For example, Evoke allows spells to be cast for an alternative cost. If the effect also grants that object an ability that only functions on the battlefield, so again, Evoke includes a triggered ability that functions only on the battlefield, in such cases, the ability lasts indefinitely, unless some other duration is stated. Accordingly, the Evoke ability would still exist and would still trigger normally, causing you to sacrifice Terrain Elemental after it enters, even if Ashling itself was no longer on the battlefield at the time when that happened. Now, I know my audience, and I know some of you are probably already typing up comments about how Evoke doesn't allow a spell to be cast in the same sense as, for example, Azula's last ability does. Or maybe about how the Evoke ability doesn't function only on the battlefield. It has components that function on the battlefield and other components that function off the battlefield. And to these people I say, it was clear from the historical context when this rule was introduced that these lines in this rule were intended to make Henzi Tor's ability that gives Blitz function. And I couldn't think of any reason why Blitz and Evoke would function any differently. I and all of the experienced judges that I consulted were unanimous in our opinion that this rule was sufficient to answer the Ashling questions presented earlier in this episode. So, if that's the case, why did WotC issue errata? And I assume that people who made it this far in the video are probably already aware that the proposed text I've been showing for Ashling isn't actually its Oracle text. This is. In addition, WotC added or modified 2 rules in connection with this card during their most recent CR update. Well, what's the deal with that? Well, what we had before may have been sufficient to allow Ashling to function as expected, but there's another similar card from a recent set that did need something to change, and that card is Zenia. Whereas Evoke is an alternative cost, Offspring is an additional cost. The Offspring ability does not therefore allow a card to be cast. Thus, Zenia does not fall under the exception granted in that rule that we looked at earlier. And so we got a new rule that specifically covers this case, and a new template because these work in a completely different way. Ashling and Zenia have spells gain the appropriate ability as you cast them. Now, this is a static ability, but it causes spells to gain an ability via a one-shot effect. Ashling works exactly the same as described previously, but with this rules and templating change, Zenia also works this way. In either case, as long as you cast a spell using the ability these cards grant, that ability will persist for the entire time the affected card is on the battlefield, regardless of whether someone plays a removal spell against Ashling or Zenia, even if that happens before the card that you cast enters. This is a functional change for Zenia, but not for Ashling, as noted earlier. This new template is easier to parse and understand on an intuitive level, but I absolutely hate it as it's much worse on a technical level. There's never been a gameplay difference between a statement that a game object has an ability versus gains an ability. Both of these have always signified that a continuous effect is acting on that game object which grants it the appropriate ability. The only difference between these has been templating. Has is used when that continuous effect originates from a static ability, and gains is used when it's set up by a resolving spell or activated or triggered ability, which up until now has been the only ways that it's possible for a continuous effect to get set up. This template that was introduced blurs the lines between these in a way that's completely new. Never has there been a time when a one-shot effect generated a continuous effect, nor has there ever been a time when an ability was added or removed other than through the action of a continuous effect. One of these two things is the case here, and it's not really specifically spelled out in the rules which one it is, but I think the intention seems to be the former, so I'll focus my concerns on that possibility. Certainly, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how the latter would cause some confusion. If it's not a continuous effect, does it still apply in the normal layer system that continuous effects use? If not, where would it happen? And what would be the interaction with continuous effects that cause game objects to lose abilities? Stuff like that. Returning our attention to the other possibility, I imagine some of you were probably surprised when I said that a one-shot effect that generated a continuous effect had never happened before. Like, what about if you played a jump on a grizzly bears? Wouldn't that qualify? And no, it doesn't. To understand the distinction, let's review the official definitions of a few technical rules terms. An effect is just something that happens in the game as a result of a spell or ability. The resolution of a spell or ability can create one-shot or continuous effects. Static abilities can also create continuous effects. As you can see, the possibility of a static ability generating a one-shot effect is so crazy, they forgot to update this rule to include that as being a possibility now. As an example, if you play this leap, when that resolves, one part of its effects is that it sets up a continuous effect that gives the targeted creature flying, and another part is that it has you draw a card, which is a one-shot effect. If you play this riding the Dilu horse, the resolution of this spell sets up a continuous effect that gives the targeted creature +2/+2 and the horsemanship ability. But it's still a continuous effect, not a one-shot effect. Not having a stated duration doesn't mean that this is a one-shot effect. It means it's a continuous effect that lasts until the end of the game. In the same way, there's a difference between a continuous effect that lasts for a specific amount of time and a one-shot effect that does something followed by a second one-shot effect that undoes that thing afterwards. This distinction has some very real rules consequences, one of which was discussed in my video on phasing out a Banisher Priest. I'm not sure if there are any similar complications that might arise from this new template, but I'm afraid that if there aren't, it's only a matter of time. Reading through the new rules, I'm still not sure what the underlying philosophy behind the new template is supposed to be, other than we needed something to make it work the way that we think it should, so here you go. The thing that really bothers me about this is that Wizards added a new rule to fix the Zinnia interaction instead of adapting the existing rule that we already had that gave the answer that they obviously wanted. So now there's 2 rules in the CR that were specifically added to do the same sort of thing for 2 different cards. Oh wait, did I say 2? Actually, I meant 3. Now if you watched my Principles of Templating video, this is, well, pretty much the opposite of what templating is supposed to be. Situations where the answer is supposed to be the same, for example, Henzi Tor and Zenia, should have identical card text and rely on identical rule structures. What I'm seeing here is a step away from a comprehensive rules framework and towards a vibes-based Yu-Gi-Oh! Style patchwork of individual rules for individual cards. This is obviously worse for players, worse for judges, and worse for everyone other than overworked rules managers who see no other option to keep up with the glut of sets coming out, since properly identifying these issues, researching, and generating solutions all take time. People complain loudly about WotC's attempts to replace artists with AI, and I really wish that we could get the same sort of response when they do the same thing for editors, templaters, and rules writers. Unfortunately, while it's relatively obvious when WotC cuts corners in one of those areas, the other requires much more technical background and is invisible to a large portion of the player base, meaning that there are less people who complain in situations where the quality is substantially degraded from where it was before. Which, spoiler alert, is exactly the situation that we're in right now. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.